Thank you, Rabbi. Can everyone hear me? You want to do a mic check?
Can you hear me? Great.
To kick us, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Belle, to kick us off, why don't you just, for those who are not as familiar with AJC, share a little bit about the organization and your role as the Chief Advocacy Officer.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be with you. Thank you so much for your hospitality. And I just have to say, I'm my mother's daughter, and I get emotional sometimes. And it's not often that we get to do speaking engagements during Shabbat services. And coming off of Yom HaShoah and just being in a community where I haven't been here before, and seeing how all over the world, Jews are doing this on Friday night, and it's different everywhere, but we're all Jewish, and we have guests, and how special our tradition is, that it can look different in different places, but we're all honoring the same tradition and the same history, and always remembering our past. So I know we're talking about anti-Semitism, and it's a tricky subject, but I just wanted to acknowledge how special that is and how nice it is to be with all of you. Back to your question.
No, before you do it, some people, I don't know if everybody knows this custom, but some people in Jewish life go, somebody says something really important or holy, they go, pshh. And so for you, I want to say, pshh, like.
Thank you so much.
Mamash gewalt. Okay, keep going.
Thank you. AJC, American Jewish Committee, is a global Jewish advocacy organization. We have 24 offices here in the United States, 13 offices and posts overseas, and 37 partnerships with Jewish community organizations all around the world. We've been around since 1906, so it's been a minute, as have many Jewish organizations. But we really have this global architecture that we use to fight anti-Semitism, promote Israel's place in the world and advocate for Israel, and defend and advance democratic values and pluralism. And we do that mainly by focusing on grass tops, on leadership. And we do high-level diplomatic advocacy around the world with world leaders, diplomats, of course, working with politicians at the local, state, and national level, engaging in political advocacy, with religious, interfaith, intergroup partners here in the United States and around the world, and with strategic communications. So we do a lot, we touch a lot of issues, but because we're speaking about anti-Semitism, obviously that's at the forefront of our agenda. I, as Chief Advocacy Officer, help coordinate our strategy all around the world on all of the issues that I just mentioned, and I'm privileged to work with our CEO to do just that. I've also had the privilege of just growing up with my professional career at AJC. I worked in the policy space, I worked as Chief of Staff, and at the very beginning, I started here working at the Republican National Convention in 2016 with our director, Lisi Shapiro, who's a wonderful mentor and runs our operation in Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio. Glad I got it right. So please meet her after as well. And that's just a little bit, and I know we'll get into more.
Thank you, Belle. So you talked about advocating at a local level, state level. So let's talk briefly about that as we start to kind of frame a context here. So exactly 2 weeks ago, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine signed an executive order defining and combating anti-Semitism. And I know you're familiar with the definition he used. And I know that AJC was involved at a national level in other areas that influenced the situation for him to do so. Can you share a little bit about, why that's important, how that definition is defined of anti-Semitism, and any other things you want to say about that executive order, other things that are happening in similar states around the country?
Sure, absolutely. And the rabbi actually alluded to this. In order to fight anti-Semitism, we need to understand it. And in the early 2000s, anti-Semitism reemerged on the European continent. Obviously, it hadn't gone away, but that's really when we saw modern-day anti-Semitism begin to manifest again when we're talking about the post-Holocaust era. And what AJC and other organizations and really leadership, in political leadership, realized is that in order to actually fight this hatred, we need to better understand it, we need to define it, and we need to give particularly law enforcement a tool to really be able to identify what is anti-Semitism. And as we'll discuss tonight, it's not always easy to define, although sometimes easy for us to see it. It manifests in a variety of forms. So the working definition of anti-Semitism, which AJC helped draft, helped just to do just that. And it's actually not the definition that's so interesting, right? Of course, We know what anti-Semitism is, and that it's hatred of Jews, it's discrimination against Jews, but it's actually the examples. The definition lays out a variety of different examples in which anti-Semitism has manifested in Europe and around the world and in the United States. Denying the Holocaust, right? That's not necessarily what pops into our minds here in the United States when we think about anti-Semitism. In Europe, it's quite a big problem. That's one example. It's not just attacking synagogues, right? So I think there are 15, 20 examples that lay out what this could look like, including relating to when criticizing Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism, and we'll get more into that. But that became very important in Europe. And now, with rising domestic anti-Semitism, the tool's being used here as well. And we're seeing more and more states and governments, local and state, really beginning to use this tool and to say, again, this isn't legally binding, but this is gonna help law enforcement and others, educators, understand anti-Semitism, define it, identify it, use it to report hate crimes against Jews, and really raise national consciousness against anti-Semitism. So it's a very important tool. I'm very glad it was passed and adopted here in Ohio in quite a strong way, I should say. And whether it's government officials and even university administrators who are using this tool, we're seeing it help educate, build awareness, and really make a difference.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. It seems in all the dialogue that we have online and in person, everything's seen through a political lens. And so I'm curious, people, sometimes there's commentary out there, there's right-wing anti-Semitism, there's left-wing anti-Semitism. Can you talk a little bit about those, what they mean, and how they manifest in each area?
Absolutely, and I should first start off by saying, and I should have mentioned it earlier, AJC is strictly nonpartisan. So what I'm saying, I'm gonna be very honest with you, none of it is political. To us, it's not about politics, it's about policies and identifying the issues and being very thoughtful about them. So this is our nuanced analysis that is strictly apolitical. Anti-Semitism has a variety of forms. We see in the United States and also in Europe, it's easy to define the most obvious examples from the right and from the left. On the right, we see mostly white nationalism, which the rabbi mentioned as well. And that's very easy for us to identify and to understand. We also see more manifestations of really the initial origins of anti-Semitism deep-rooted in Christianity, and some very deep-rooted beliefs in Christianity that I think in large part are gone, which is good, but sometimes are still there, and we see that manifested on the right. It's totally okay. If a cell phone didn't go off, it wouldn't be a program, so we needed it to happen. That just makes it extra special. On the left, it's interesting because if on the right, Jews are seen as kind of inferior and by white nationalists, on the left, Jews are seen almost as white supremacists, as globalists who have too much power. And in this environment that we're in right now in the United States, where so much is about us versus them, black versus white, in a really horrible way, Jews are seen as part of that powerful and as part of the problem. So that's part of it. And we also see it on the left manifest in hatred against Israel. And that looks very different from depending on who you're talking to, and I know we'll get more into that. Those are the two primary sources. The third main source, which we're seeing unfortunately more of here, but really the most of it in Europe, is religious extremism and really Islamist extremism, which has been the cause of every single Jew who was killed in an attack on the European continent in the last 20 years was killed by Islamist extremism. But it's not about Islam, in general. It's a religious extremism problem. So those are the three key sources. But there are others, and there are others that are more difficult to talk about. Jews who are being attacked in Brooklyn, for example, on the streets of New York, are not being attacked by any of those sources. They're being attacked in large part by minority communities who hold different views of Jews. And that's really difficult to talk about, and it's part of the work we do at AJC in having those tough conversations with partner communities about those sensitivities. There are many others, and we believe in being equal opportunity critics of anti-Semitism, calling it out no matter the source, and as the rabbi said, I think it's important for all of us to understand the many sources of anti-Semitism to be able to identify them and to call them out and to say, no matter where this is coming from, no matter if it's a politician on the right or on the left or from a community member or a friend who might not know they're being anti-Semitic, when they say that Israel is like the Nazi regime, we have to be able to understand and to call it out.
So you mentioned deep-seated beliefs, misperceptions, bigotry from age-old Christian era, and one of the old anti-Semitic slurs that I don't hear often now, thank goodness, is Christ killer. But that was when I was a kid, and probably many people here, even a little bit older than me, probably remember that as an anti-Semitic slur. That has, I think, for the most part, has gone away. However, related to Israel, people are saying racist, colonizer, propaganda of apartheid. Are these sort of the new Christ killer in a more subtle way than what maybe others in other generations experienced? How would you describe that? How would you deal with that?
It's complicated. So in a way, yes, because Jews, and I think this is one of the ways that anti-Semitism is manifesting, is that Jews are sometimes held responsible, like we're all responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. And I'm not saying that all of the actions that you just, I would say the actions or the labels associated with the state of Israel, because I don't agree that they're true, and we'll come back to that. By making that connection and basically saying, oh, if Israel is committing apartheid, all Jews are responsible, that kind of is like Christ killer. As if the Jews killed Jesus, all Jews are held responsible. So in a way, it's there. But it's a little bit different because I would say there are layers between Jews and Israel and apartheid. There's a lot of misinformation. It's not a deep-rooted belief. It's a new modern-day form of anti-Semitism, and honestly, in a way that a lot of people who are throwing around these claims first of all, don't understand, so there's ignorance. They don't necessarily understand they're being anti-Semitic. Some do. Don't understand the connection between Jews and the state of Israel, and that looks different for every Jew and in every community. And just don't understand the history of what they're talking about. So it's much more nuanced, but at the same time, I do think we have to be aware of the accusations and the ignorance in the same way, and they deserve the same amount of attention, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's so many questions. So let's go and drill down a little bit about that, about these terms that people will throw around. If any of us are encountering somebody saying, well, Israel's racist or they practice apartheid, how would you educate us to eloquently and directly respond to those accusations?
So there are a lot of terms and a lot of accusations. I would say first and foremost, it would take us a full year course to become experts in answering the accusations, but because this has become such a big problem, we at AJC and many others have developed resources to give kind of the short responses to accusations like that we're trying to get into the hands of particularly young people who are facing this on college campuses, but for all of us who might not be able to legally define, the definition of apartheid and can't pull that out off the top of our head. But I'll say this. When it comes to Israel, right, I'm a Zionist. I'm a proud Zionist. I believe in the Jewish right to self-determination. I believe in the state of Israel. It exists. It's not going anywhere. Is Israel perfect? No. It's not perfect. Is it okay to criticize Israel? Yes, just like we criticize our country. By the way, in Israel, there's robust criticism of Israeli policy. It's a robust democracy. But when it comes to certain terms and certain accusations, we are crossing the line from criticism into anti-Semitism. And that was best defined by Natan Sharansky, who was the chairman of the Jewish Agency, a Soviet refusenik, and he defined the 3 Ds, right? Double standards, delegitimization, and demonization. And when you engage in one of those things, according to Natan Sharansky, and he's a smart guy, you're being anti-Semitic, and you're really crossing that line. Zionism is the belief that Jews have a right to self-determination. Anti-Zionism means that you don't believe that Jews have the right to self-determination, which today is the modern day form of the state of Israel. Zionism has happened, right? We have a Jewish state. So to be an anti-Zionist, to us at AJC, and I think for many, means to be anti-Semitic, because you're particularly saying that Jews don't have the right to have a state. By the way, you're not saying that Palestinians don't have a right to have a state. I believe that Palestinians should have a state. But being anti-Zionist means you're singling out Jews in particular. Now, if you don't believe that anyone should have a nation state, you happen to be an anti-Zionist who's not anti-Semitic, okay?
I have some relatives like that.
Yeah, and there are a couple examples, and I want to be intellectually honest about that. Because there are people who think that we should all have open borders and we're all one people, okay. But that, for the most part, is not the case. Demonization, let's go back to that. Apartheid was a real thing. It happened in South Africa. It was a systematized form of racism. I know it's hard for some people to understand, but even using that term in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with all of the issues and the history is intellectually dishonest, number one, and it is trying to demonize Israel. Some don't understand that they're doing it, again, when they say that, but that is actually, for people who know what they're talking about, what they're doing. Israel didn't want to have a separation barrier or a security fence. It was built after the Second Intifada, which is quite recent history, because people were coming into Israel and blowing themselves up in suicide bombings on buses and cafes. Again, I'm gonna repeat that because a lot of people don't know that. That didn't exist before the early 2000s. People were free flowing, there was free movement. Nobody wanted to have any form of separation, or I should say, maybe some did, but it wasn't a state wish to create that. So just that example alone, there's so much history and nuance and context that has led us to these situations, so it's intellectually dishonest. Tell me another term.
Wait, before you move on, I just want to say, I don't know if anybody else has this personal experience, but I have friends in Israel who are super liberal. Test. And when I was in Israel many years ago, just after the wall was built, they were saying, I hate the wall. I don't want the wall, but I know that we need the wall, right? Like they didn't want it, right? And many other people here might have a personal experience. Like when Sbarro Pizzeria was bombed in the early/mid 2000s, like that was my pizza place. That was where I hung out when I was visiting Israel. And so that's a small sliver of what I'm going through as an American Jew, let alone Israelis are going through. And so people don't understand that the reason why the wall was created was because of those bombings. And so I think it's also important that, this is just me speaking here, that we add, if you have any personal context when you're talking with your friends, to add that in there, because I think it makes it more human and more relatable and not just facts and figures and not definitions of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. So you said the 3 Ds. I think you covered 2. Demonization. What are the 3?
You're right, I didn't cover all of them.
Let's repeat them together. You say a word, and then we'll repeat. 1, 2, 3. No, I'm serious. You say one. What's
Demonization.
Demonization.
Double standards.
Double standards.
And delegitimization.
Delegitimization.
It's actually quite hard to say.
It is. It's a tongue twister.
So we covered, well, apartheid kind of covers a couple of them,
Yeah.
but double standards is actually quite easy. The United Nations has singled out Israel more than any other country in the world as if it is the single greatest human rights abuser that exists. It has an agenda item number 7. Every year they talk about only what's going on in Israel. Now again, I'm not saying there aren't challenges. There are. There are very difficult challenges that the Israelis and the Palestinians have to grapple with. But to make it seem as if Israel is the greatest human rights abuser in the entire world, given everything that is going on in the world right now, by the way, and just in the past 10 years alone, Syria, I don't have to name these for you, is outrageous. That is a double standard. That is singling out the one and only Jewish state. That's all I'm going to have to say about that. We covered demonization we covered demonization. Delegitimization is basically any language that talks about the Israel as if it shouldn't exist. And I'll give you, it's a country. It exists. I'll give you an example. Part of the Palestinian liberation movement uses a slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." That basically means that Israel should be wiped off the map. And we can get into the complexity of this, because again, not everybody thinks about that when they're saying it, right? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like the sexy social justice cause of our time. And it's really unfortunate because it's so misunderstood. That is delegitimizing the state of Israel and its right to exist, and that's problematic. We're not doing that to many other states. We're not saying many other countries shouldn't exist. Demonization, I mentioned the apartheid claim. Another, probably the most prominent example is saying that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide. As a Jew, as a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, that statement is deeply, deeply offensive to me, and should be to anyone, both as Jews, but also, again, intellectual honesty. People have died in Gaza. People have died because of Israel's actions in Gaza. We can talk more about that. Israelis go out of their way to prevent civilian casualties. It's obviously messy and terrible and complicated, but Israel is not intentionally killing civilians. And to make that accusation is demonization.
We're going to go to the audience here for a moment, for some questions. There's so much to cover. I'm going to give you some scenarios as kind of a lightning round to help us, give us some things we might say relative to some examples that maybe we come in contact with in our everyday life. Okay, so many people here have either children or grandchildren at Ohio State or other university or wherever around the country, college kids, and they want to support LGBTQ plus, and they want to go to on the Pride Parade, whether they're gay or not, right? And they want to bring their rainbow flag with a Jewish star on it. And then the organizers tell them, no, you can't do that because that's going to trigger other people, right? So how would we coach that young person, if they would allow us to be coached? What would we say to support them to what they could say back to those organizers that make that claim?
Oof. I feel that deeply, and I'm so sorry that, I know, again, we can talk for hours. I'm so sorry that young people have to experience that, right? That makes me deeply upset, and I know that's a big reality that we're facing. I would say, in that situation, you should say to that young person, Israel has a thriving LGBTQ community. It is the only country in the Middle East where it's legal, and not just legal, welcomed to have an LGBTQ identity. So the fact that that's triggering for you who they're talking to means that we should probably have a conversation for you to learn more about that. Me as a Jew celebrating the Jewish state that is welcoming of gay pride, gay rights should be something that I am allowed to celebrate. I'm sorry that it's triggering for you. Again, we should talk about that. But being a proud Zionist and proud LGBTQ supporter should not be, are totally logically, they go together.
One more, and then we're going to go to the audience for some questions. So feel free to get your questions ready. So recently at Ohio State, they, I believe it's the student council, passed a motion around BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. For those who might not be familiar, just give a brief description of that. But also, what do we say to our college students who have to deal with that? And some of these kids Jewish kids might even think, gosh, is that anti-Semitism? Is it not? How do I respond? I know it's a huge topic, but can you give us just a brief description of that?
So the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement was really started. It's a tool of political pressure to try to get, or actually economic pressure, to try to translate that into political pressure to get Israel to change its policies towards the Palestinians. Overarchingly, it has failed. And I would say, as a student of conflict studies...
Pause. Why do you say it's failed? That's helpful.
Because people aren't divesting from Israel. Israel's economy is thriving. This attempt is, tactically, is not working, specifically in its ultimate goal. However, in the public arena, it's causing a lot of damage, because it's encouraging this idea that there is a cause that we need to be rallying behind to get everyone to divest from Israel, to put pressure on Israel to change its policies, when in reality, it has the opposite effect. When Israel, and by the way, any conflict is in a siege mentality and feels that it's under pressure, that no one responds well to that. So if it were working, I can tell you as a student of conflict studies, it's not a helpful strategy. And again, there's part of the reason that it's effective to talk about BDS is because there's parallels to apartheid South Africa, and that idea that pressure really worked and helped change policies, when it's just simply not. It's a different situation and a different case. But on college campuses, it's become, again, this social justice cause, right? If you care about the Palestinians, you should be engaging in BDS. You should be calling for BDS. You should be calling for boycotts against Israel. And that's really damaging to anyone who cares about Israel, and by the way, wants to be part of social justice causes and progressive causes on college campuses. What's happening is basically, if you're part of that space, you're being told, if you support Israel, you need to either step away or check that part of your identity at the door to be a part of this club.
So don't be a social justice warrior because you support Israel.
You can't be a social justice warrior if you support Israel. That's basically like the big picture is what's happening.
And is that, going back to our earlier sort of definition of anti-Semitism / anti-Zionism, is that anti-Semitic? Is it anti-Zionist? How would you define those terms relative to this particular situation?
I would say that it's anti-Semitic, because if you tell someone that they can't believe that if they support Israel, they're not progressive, again, you're discriminating against a part of their Jewish identity. That's engaging in anti-Semitism. Now, the policy of BDS, and whether it's anti-Semitic, we believe at American Jewish Committee it is. But I will say, there are plenty of people who are supporting the BDS cause because they want to see change in Israel. They believe that that's important. They're not necessarily doing that because they don't want Israel to exist. It's very nuanced here, right? They just think it's important to change the policy, and they believe that that's a way to do it, right? So they're trying to be, again, social justice warriors. But the founders of BDS have very openly stated, founders of the movement, that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So that is in the underpinnings of the movement. And again, a lot of the followers might not know that, but that's really what it's at the root, and that's why it's problematic.
Thank you. So we're going to shift to the audience. There's going to be a microphone here. Do we have a third one, or do I give this one up? I give this one up. Okay. Don't take it away from me. Okay, so you're going to use this microphone here, and you can just line up and ask a question to Belle.
Don't be shy.
She's ready for tough questions.
A familiar face.
Hi, Belle. My name's Jeremy Sosin. As you saw, I play guitar from time to time. I'm also on the board of AJC Cleveland and our chair of our advocacy committee here, and I am immensely grateful for your wisdom and guidance. Can you share a few words about the positive impacts of the Abraham Accords? In large part, what I've seen when community organizers make it easy for politicians to stick their neck out because they're so in support of something, it's easy for politicians to do it. But here we have Arab countries that have done something extraordinary. And now they're making space for lots and lots of progress between Arab countries and Israel, and how that can be part of the discussions that you're talking about tonight. So when people, for instance, are making a comment about how Israel is so oppressive, you can point to these other relationships and say, well, you know, it's not true across the Arab world, and here's an example. So if you could share a few words.
Such a great question, and here's really where it gets interesting, right? Because I think one of the greatest arguments against, Israel is, everything that Israel does is wrong, it's such a black and white picture, is exactly what Jeremy just described. AJC has been engaged for over 25 years in this long game of trying to get Arab countries in the Middle East to increase their engagement with Israel through quiet diplomacy, hundreds of meetings with ambassadors and heads of state, and really trying to build those relationships. So we've seen, that dialogue and relationship building firsthand that really led to the Abraham Accords. We just opened an office in Abu Dhabi in the UAE and are seeing on the ground really what's happening. And it's amazing to see Emiratis talking publicly in restaurants with their friends and their leaders about engagement with Israel and how wonderful it is, economic diversity between the two countries, Israelis flying to the UAE and going on vacation there and vice versa. I mean, it's truly incredible. And I know so many of you in this room would easily say to me, 10 years ago, we would have never thought this could have happened, right? And it's not just the UAE. Morocco, Bahrain, and I can tell you, having just been to the region, more are coming. And something we talk a lot about here in the US when, again, we're seeing this visceral reaction towards Israel on college campuses and in the media, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen when the Middle East gets ahead of the discourse here? What is everybody gonna do? And this is my hope, right? And I think AJC's hope, when more and more Arab countries make peace with Israel, and this idea of an outside-in approach where hopefully those relationships will bring the Palestinians to the table because they're gonna see this is becoming the cool thing to do in the region, and it's time for us to move past the complicated history, find out an agreement that works for both parties and recognizes the concerns, the real concerns of both parties. And we have this flourishing region. What's everybody gonna complain about? And I ask that, and I'm half joking, but I'm not, because there's so much opportunity there. So we're seeing that increasing. I think it's gonna bring a lot more positivity to the region, and it's really important because I worry on the one hand about any student who believes in Israel as part of their identity and supporting Israel. I don't want them to say, I know I hear you complaining about the Palestinians, but look at the Abraham Accords. Because as important as it is, anytime that happens, and I've been in those situations, so the person on the other side of the conversation is gonna say, well, that's a deflection, right? You're deflecting from the root of what's actually happening. So they're in a tough spot. I think it's important to talk about it, but at the same time, I don't wanna get away from the fact that we need to be educating young people and supporters of Israel about these nuances, about history. I know nobody talks about history anymore, but we need to be giving them the tools to have those conversations. We might not convince everyone, but we at least need to be doing our best to make sure that they do have the facts and can answer those tough questions.
Hi, I'm Rob Schwab. I'm visiting from Cleveland, and my daughter and her family are members of the synagogue here. So it's wonderful to be here tonight. I wanted to note and comment on and ask for your reflection. I wanted to note the passing of Senator Orrin Hatch recently, who was a great supporter and a lover of Israel. I met him and Nikki Haley, also another great supporter of Israel, in 2016 at the Republican Convention in Cleveland. And I was struck at the time by how passionate, how deeply they spoke about Israel. And it was really cute. What Orrin Hatch's comment, he goes, you know, he said to me, he goes, there's probably 4 Jews in Utah, and I don't think I get any of their votes. He goes, but I'm still, you know, a big supporter of Israel. So I guess my question, I thought it'd be interesting to hear who some of your best allies are, maybe to talk a little bit about our allies in combating anti-Semitism.
Thank you for your question. And Orrin Hatch was a dear friend of AJC. We worked closely with him, particularly actually on interreligious affairs in addition to his support for Israel, so I'm glad you mentioned it. The good news is support for Israel and actually the fight against anti-Semitism in the United States from political leadership on both sides of the aisle is very, very strong, right? Again, I want to stress on both sides of the aisle because as we all know, how the media works is that those who are really loud and with the most Twitter followers get the attention. There's this myth that exists that the Democratic Party is becoming the party of anti-Israelism, and I want to stress very strongly, that's not true. That is not true. The votes show that's not true. Should we be concerned about the small number of very left-leaning members of the Democratic Party who are being loud? Yes, and we have to have those tough conversations and engage. But I would say politically, support is overwhelming, and I'm not gonna name everyone because there are a lot of people. Where it gets trickier but also more interesting and actually gives me optimism is some of our intergroup and interfaith partners. Whether that's nationally or Lisi can speak more locally to what's happening here in Ohio, there are so many people who understand non-Jews who understand what Israel is, whether we've taken them to Israel or we've had just conversations and they know from their own upbringing or interactions with Jews and others who have been to Israel, who understand that Israel is the United States' most important ally, is a progressive cause, has so much to offer to the world. So there are many allies. And you're right in thinking, Jeremy, to your question about optimism, that's another story we need to be telling. I think we don't tell it enough because we're so concerned about this wave of anti-Semitism and this wave of anti-Zionism and huge criticism of Israel. But you're right, we have to remember the positive that there are so many allies. And it's a big part of the work of having those conversations, bringing people to Israel, a big part of our work and what everyone here can do in making sure that we are telling that positive story and creating opportunities for engagement about all of the positivity.
My name is Harvey Krieger, and my daughter Courtney, in the early 2000s, when you were talking about, she was in college and at Ohio State University. And Kenner Sebo's daughter just recently, 2 years ago, got involved in this, as my daughter did. I have a right to be heard. This is what you hear in college campuses when people who don't feel that like we feel, who are anti-Semitic, but they have the nuances and they start to, they get an audience. So why do they not have the right to be heard? How can we explain that, yes, everybody has free speech, etc., but this free speech is so damaging, not only in the anti-Israel type, but all other types of our political views. So how do we explain to people who say, well, I want to hear what they have to say, they have a right just like you have a right, but theirs is so damaging? How do we explain that?
Let me just ask you a question before you sit down. When you say they, who are you, what type,
Yeah,
are
that's
we
a
talking
good
about David
question.
Duke?
I hate when people say they to me. I just hate that. People who really don't agree with your point of view. So my point of view, I want to hear what he has to say. That's who they are.
So this, thank you for your question. So I think college campuses are exactly the place where everyone should be heard, right? We should have fierce intellectual debate. I don't think, and we see it play out where there are protests of speakers who come to college campuses, whether they are super pro-Israel or they're IDF soldiers, or if they're Palestinians who have called for the destruction of the state of Israel. And that is a battle that is playing out, by the way, not just on this issue, but free speech issues in general, right? If we believe in free speech, who gets to decide when someone is crossing the line from free speech into incitement, right? And we as a society have not figured that out. And often what happens is each campus is making their own decision, right? Sometimes a president of a university decides, I'm shutting down this speaker, and there's huge backlash. So I don't have a good answer to your question because we haven't figured that out. I will say that part of the reason that this conversation about defining anti-Semitism is so important, and when we talked about the definition, it comes back to that. It's one thing to criticize Israel. It's another thing to say things that suggest that Israel shouldn't exist, right? So if you have a speaker who is openly calling for the destruction of the state of Israel, I would say that's anti-Semitism, and they shouldn't have a platform on a college campus. So that's where you have to explain the nuance. And I've seen firsthand, we just had AJC and several other Jewish organizations brought together a summit of university administrators, over 40 of them, presidents and administrators, and Lisi would kill me if I didn't say that 3 of them were from Ohio. And yeah, we can applaud Ohio. And they came together to talk about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment on college campuses because of exactly of your question, because they don't know what to do in those situations. They don't necessarily understand the nuances. By the way, how could they? We don't understand the nuances. If you asked me before I worked at AJC, I couldn't explain all of this to you. So we have to get better informed so that we can have those conversations. And I want to say one more thing, which is related to your question. I want to acknowledge openly that there's a whole generation, a group of people, my age or younger. I don't think there are, hundreds of thousands of them, but there's a group that have very, very strong beliefs about Israel. And I would say they're anti-Israel, they're anti-Zionist, many of them, and they're Jews. We're not necessarily going to convince all of them and get them back. And I want to be open about that. There's a group called If Not Now. They're people my age who started this group who I think would tell you, they might not say this to you, I will diagnose them, they grew up in the Jewish community, and they were fed a story that Israel is all about falafel and dancing and Jewish pride and identity, and it's wonderful. And that was a failure of our community, all of us, because we didn't necessarily explain the nuances. We didn't talk about the Palestinians. I'm lucky I got more exposure to that part of the conversation, but not everyone did, and they feel lied to. So they've gone to the extreme. There's a group of people like that. And what I don't want is that for that voice to get louder, because they're wrong. Again, Israel's not perfect, but they're wrong. It's not black and white. Israel has tried to make peace. I can go on and on, you know. But my point is, what we can do now is try to educate those who have the opportunity to learn. We can tell our children, my future children, your children, grandchildren, the story of Israel. We can explain the complex history. We can explain the connection between Jewish identity and Israel. And you don't have to want to live in Israel. You don't have to be obsessed with Israel, but you can acknowledge that there is a Jewish connection to Israel, and you can support the idea of the Jews living in Israel and their right to do so. So it's our obligation to do that, so we can try to change the course of these conversations so that more people, Jewish and non-Jewish, understand those nuances. I think that's where we have to course correct.
Sure. Thank you, Belle, because I was going to just ask that question, and you answered it. So, okay, Ron, you get the last question. I feel like Phil Dine.
Ron Letterman. I just finished a semester course at the University of Akron in anti-Semitism. And one of the things we discussed was the history, back to St. Augustine and that. Can you give everybody a little overview of that? Because a lot of people don't realize how far back anti-Semitism goes.
My answer is no, because it will take too long. But because it really has evolved, right? Very briefly, we mentioned the roots in Christianity. But when you go from there, the history of anti-Semitism branches out in so many different ways in the Arab world, in Europe, in the United States. So I wouldn't be doing it justice. I can say that if you go to our website, and I'm not just promoting AJC, but I'm saying this with pride because we just spent a year creating a resource page on anti-Semitism and a resource page on Israel. So if you go to resources, you can look at all of the information that we have that will explain. There's a whole article on the history of anti-Semitism. And I'm glad that you took a course on it because it's so important to understand, and it has so many implications for what we're seeing today.
I'm going to pass it back to you in just a moment, Rabbi. I just want to say thank you so much, Belle. It's really hard. Yes, please. It's such an important topic, and it's very rewarding to have this conversation with you, to hear what you have to say about it, and to have this conversation with the multiple congregations that are here tonight. You know, I guess I want to wrap up with, I think we forget that this thing called anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is a lifelong pursuit. My sons Jonah and Gideon are 8 and 10. And when the Pittsburgh shooting happened a few years ago, and they were even much younger, it broke our hearts, but we wanted to tell them because we didn't want them to hear it from somebody else in school. And that was the beginning of their education about anti-Semitism. Now, maybe technically you could say, well, Passover is the beginning, right? And so this morning, they overheard my wife Becky and I talking about Ukraine and how JDC, another alphabet soup of Jewish organizations, is helping take Holocaust survivors from the Ukraine and bringing them to Germany, of all places. And we were kind of chuckling at the irony of that. And they, being curious young little boys, said, well, tell us more about that. And they sort of know a little bit about the Holocaust at an age-appropriate thing, and we started to talk about that. And our youngest, Gideon, said, what is anti-Semitism again? And I referenced Michael Levin and said he has a whole course. a college course on anti-Semitism, and that it would take us weeks and weeks to actually answer that. But the short version is X, right? And it was just by happenstance that we had this conversation this morning, and it really, we've been planning this thing for weeks, and Marty and Bruce and others have been planning for even longer, and it really dawned on me today that, like, it is such a lifelong pursuit. And I guess I want to say thank you for being here tonight and traveling this way, because it's so important for us to continue to do that. And that you mentioned the resources that we can all reference at AJC and ADL and JDC and all the other organizations out there, and that we have to find some time in our lives to educate ourselves, because it's not going away. And we wish it away, but it is not. And then the last thing I would say is we should also be proud Zionists, in whatever flavor that means to you. And one way to do that, shameless plug coming, is that next week is Yom Ha'atzmaut, and the Jewish Community Board of Akron is sponsoring a free concert. Rami Feinstein from Israel will be here to sing some music of his own original music. He sings in Hebrew and English, and we recommend you come. Efrat, as you know, Efrat, she's going to be selling her falafels. It'll be a great time for all, so please, next Thursday night, May 5th, please come to that event, 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock. And with that, I pass back the microphone to Rabbi Josh.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, can I say one more
Please,
thing?
please.
I was inspired. Very quickly, very quickly. I don't like to leave any event without giving an action item, right? Because we all, and I'm glad you inspired me to say it, we all have to know what we can do, right? But it's not just educating ourselves. I think it's really important, given what's happened in the United States, and we at AJC are talking about this a lot. No matter how you feel about Israel, okay? We're Jewish, or for allies in the room, right? Be proud Jews, whatever that means to you, or be a proud Jewish ally. We have a thriving history in this country. It doesn't just start with the Jews. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, and it's an attack on the democracy that we all love and support in this country. So when you're standing up for your friend, or to a friend when they're having a debate about Israel, fine. But more than that, just be proud in your Jewish identity. May is Jewish Heritage Month. We're pushing Jewish and proud at AJC. So if that's the one thing I want you to take away, aside from the fact that we all need to learn more about this, just remember to be proud.
So thank you.